Good afternoon. I'm Robert George. I have the honor to be the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton, and we're co-sponsoring this afternoon's event with the Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs, and I want to express my gratitude to the school for its cooperation with us in this event. I also want to express my gratitude to Rabbi Eitan Webb, whose initiative really launched our bringing Dr. Bolton here this afternoon. John Bolton currently serves as Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where the focus of his work is in foreign policy and international organizations. Prior to joining AEI, Ambassador Bolton served as the United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations from August 1st, 2005 to December 9th, 2006. From June 2001 to May 2005, the Ambassador served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and prior to that, he was Senior Vice President of the American Enterprise Institute. Ambassador Bolton, in addition to the work I just mentioned in government, spent many years in public service. He was an Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs at the Department of State. He was Assistant Attorney General in the Department of Justice from 1985 to 89. He was Assistant Administrator for Program and Policy Coordination at the USAID, the development agency, and was General Counsel for the U.S. Agency for International Development. He is a lawyer. He was with the firm of Covington and Burling in its Washington office, a very eminent firm, and he's currently of counsel to an equally eminent firm, the firm of Kirkland and Ellis. Ambassador Bolton received both his undergraduate degree, summa cum laude, and his law degree from Yale University, where he was also an editor of the Yale Law Review. So it's a pleasure to welcome and to introduce you Ambassador John Bolton.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robbie, and thank you, Rabbi, for the idea of inviting me here. Thank all of you for coming today. I must say I don't think I've been to Princeton since I was an undergraduate at Yale, when my perhaps faulty memory is that I came here twice to watch Yale beat Princeton in football. Where I think when you all travel to New Haven this fall, you'll probably see the same result, but maybe not, who knows. It is a great pleasure to be here, even though I didn't receive the Nobel Prize today. I was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize last year. For some reason, they didn't give it to me. But hope springs eternal, you know. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about the United Nations and its relationship with the United States, and I'll try and do that in principally in contemporary terms. In the speaking that I've done since leaving the United Nations, I actually have not spent a lot of time talking about the UN, in part because I think in the vast sweep of American affairs, the UN just isn't that important. I remember years ago sitting in Jean Kirkpatrick's office at AEI, which is now the office that I hold, and asking her if at any point, what her answer was when people said, "I think we ought to withdraw from the United Nations." And I'll never forget Jean's answer. She says, "It's not worth the trouble." One day I'll come up with an answer that good, but in the meantime, I'm going to steal Jean's, because I think that we've seen over the past 15 or 20 years, basically since the end of the Cold War, both the promise and the difficulties that the UN faces in a number of different ways. And I want to try and talk about some of them today. It's obviously a vast subject. In fact, that's one of the UN's problems, is that its sweep and its scope is so broad that inevitably I think it loses much of its focus, and that a more limited institution, particularly on the political side of things, might actually have greater possibilities for success. And I want to talk about three broad categories: the category of norming the behavior of member governments, the category of UN reform, and then the category of the UN's failure to address the central threats to international peace and security of our time, terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I want to start with norming, because this is not well understood even in academic circles in the United States, and certainly not out among the general population. But I think as we face the prospect of an Obama presidency, that we will see an increase in efforts to use the UN system for norming, as we did in part at the end of the Clinton administration. And norming is something that takes a variety of different forms, but it is, in broad strokes, it's an effort to make national behavior conform to a prevailing wisdom held by various eminences around the world. I call them the high-minded. The high-minded, because you see, they have a better vision than you and I do. They're not struggling with parochial loyalties. You know, you can bet none of them are out there irrationally clinging to their religion and their guns. They know better than us. They know better than us. And if you just get used to it and agree to their norming projects, you'd be a lot better off. Let me just take a couple of examples that we've seen in recent years. The first is we find that the United Nations, mostly through the old Human Rights Commission, actually has a policy on the death penalty. It's against the death penalty, and it's against the death penalty by fairly overwhelming votes. Now, you might say, why does the United Nations have a position on the death penalty? Isn't that a matter for the member states to decide on their own? Well, I can't answer the question, but it's part of the norming process. Of course the UN has a position on the death penalty. Now, here's what's fundamentally wrong with the norming process as a whole. In the United States, which I hope everybody in this room agrees is a functioning system of representative government, in the United States, we have widely varying and strongly held views on the death penalty. We debate it at the federal level in Congress. We debate it at the state level. Sometimes states abolish the death penalty. New Jersey just did fairly recently. Sometimes states reinstitute the death penalty. Public opinion polls show that support is sometimes up and sometimes down. But the fundamental point is we debate the death penalty. This is a matter in our democratic society that people can express their views on, and their elected representatives express their views on. Why the United Nations has any role in it at all is completely inexplicable to me. That's one case of norming, and this is a case where the clear impetus is to norm the United States. And it runs into a variety of difficulties. Democratic theory, which I've just expressed, is one. The American Constitution is another. A friend of mine who's a law professor at Harvard once told me a story at some conference, an international conference held here in the United States. He heard a law professor say the problem with the United States is their attachment to their Constitution. And if only we could shake that, we could get on with international norming in a much more productive way, indeed. Let's take a couple other examples of norming. One is the question of abortion. Now, abortion is another issue where people in this country have strongly held views, pro and con, where the issue is debated in national and state and local campaigns, where we fight about this in our legislatures and in our courts. We do it all the time. It's not an issue, I think, that will be settled anytime soon. And like the question of the death penalty, it doesn't matter whether you're for abortion or against abortion. In a free society, you have a chance to argue the point, and if you get a majority, you prevail. In the UN, abortion, which sometimes goes under the rubric of reproductive rights, is something that we debate endlessly, even though in most cases we know what the outcome is going to be. Formulations that have been argued about for several decades usually end up being included in the documents that are the subject of negotiation. Now, you would think that the issue of abortion is something that would come up, you know, in the World Health Organization or in some other body that might arguably have some interest in the subject. That would be a logical perspective, but considered in the context of the UN, wrong, of course. We've argued in my career in New York about things like reproductive rights in the occupied territories. Now, you might say, why are we talking about reproductive rights in the occupied territories? That's another question I can't answer, except the pro-abortion people think that one day the American representatives, at least under the Bush administration, would be asleep, and they'd get a half a phrase into this deathless prose about the occupied territories that would nudge the debate a little bit in their direction. I don't understand, frankly, why we're talking about reproductive rights in the occupied territories, or in most cases, why we're talking about the occupied territories, certainly in the General Assembly and other UN bodies that aren't going to have any impact on it anyway. But this is a case where the debate goes on and on over an issue that for the United States we ought to be resolving among ourselves. Take another example, gun control. This was a subject of intense debate during two sessions of the General Assembly during the Bush administration, first in 2001 and second in 2006. And the rubric for this debate, obviously over yet another subject that's a matter of intense discussion within our body politic, the rubric was small arms and light weapons. And the argument basically was the UN ought to do something to stop the flow of small arms and light weapons into conflict zones around the world to help prevent gross abuses of human rights and to protect UN peacekeepers. Now, this is a subject that has serious merits to it, drawn in that context. But the real agenda of most of the non-governmental organizations that attended these two meetings of the UN was domestic American gun control. And they were able to sweep it up in the rubric of small arms and light weapons, which, by the way, includes crew-served mortars, and make it all sound like it was part of the same subject. I was pleased to give the U.S. statement in 2001 at the opening session of this conference, and I caused a firestorm when I said the United States would not agree to any final document from this conference, which, if enacted as positive law in the United States, would violate the U.S. Constitution. Well, you would have thought I'd said something really objectionable. It just sort of not done to talk about constitutions in the UN. But the fact was we saw much of the language that was being proposed as being violative of the Second Amendment. And that was a position not that I derived myself, but that I took from recent Justice Department opinions which, by the way, have now been endorsed essentially by the United States Supreme Court. But this, to me, was a very fundamental point, because what you discuss in international bodies seems to me to be something that you should not be able to use as an end run around domestic political processes, especially in democratic countries. And that is the unifying theme for norming in the UN system, whether it's gun control or abortion or the death penalty. There are elements within the American political system that aren't getting what they want out of our regular political process. And in what I have to say is a fairly ingenious political maneuver, they have taken these debates, or they're trying to take these debates, out of the context of our national political debate and internationalizing them. To say, well, how can you be in favor of the death penalty when the UN overwhelmingly opposes the death penalty? Or how can you be for abortion when the UN overwhelmingly opposes abortion? Or how can you be against gun control when the UN overwhelmingly opposes abortion? And they know, because they've had experience with the American State Department over the years, there's nothing the State Department hates more than being isolated. So they're able to prey on a cultural weakness in our diplomatic representation to force issues that are properly the subject of legitimate domestic political debate, trying to reach agreement that in turn is then brought back to the United States and said, with the argument, how can you oppose this? Why, my goodness, you'll be isolated in the world. I find this and this entire norming exercise fundamentally illegitimate. And I think, as they like to say, the Founding Fathers would have as well. I think you're going to see more and more of this because for every dissatisfied domestic non-governmental organization that isn't getting what it wants out of our political process, there's a group of them that are prepared to try and take their issues internationally. And I think this is going to be a real flashpoint in our political debate into the future. I just don't simply think the UN system is the place to argue out issues that are to be argued in free political systems in their domestic context. The second issue that I want to talk about this afternoon is UN reform. Now, there is a huge amount of territory covered by the question of UN reform, so I want to try and boil it down to a few key issues which I think symbolize what the right approach to UN reform is and what, by contrast, the overwhelming majority of UN member governments see. Let's start with the Oil for Food program. When it became clear after the fall of Saddam Hussein that the government of Iraq had transformed what should have been a humanitarian aid program into a political instrument to enhance its control over the Iraqi people, it also became clear that the program had been subject to enormous fraud and mismanagement. So the then Secretary General Kofi Annan asked Paul Volcker to head an international commission of inquiry to try and find out what had gone wrong. Now, Volcker, who in the current election endorses Senator Obama, is a man of enormous stature in our political system. He has devoted much of his career to public service. And he has said publicly he took the job thinking it would be fairly short term. After all, how much could you find that had gone wrong in the Oil for Food program? And it turned out that this investigation went on and on and on. Because what he found, and I think this is one of the central insights in the Volcker Commission reports, was that the problems of fraud and mismanagement in the UN Oil for Food program were systemic to the UN itself. The Oil for Food program came out of the UN. It used UN personnel. It used UN procedures. It really derived from the UN culture. And Volcker was asked at a Senate hearing in late 2005, after his final report came out, if he thought his report demonstrated that there was a culture of corruption at the UN. And he said, no, I don't think there's a culture of corruption, although there's plenty of corruption. I think there's a culture of inaction. And indeed, that insight, I think, is one of the most powerful to come out of the Oil for Food program and its problems. And I think it highlights much of what's wrong with the UN system. Now consider the response of the UN and its member governments to the Volcker Commission report. Never so clearly summarized as during the 2005 negotiations over what was called the outcome document for the 2005 summit, where we talked about a whole range of issues, one of which was what to do about the Oil for Food scandal. And we're in the middle of negotiations, and it's, 11 o'clock at night. And a representative of the non-aligned movement raises his hand and says, I don't understand why we're calling this the Oil for Food scandal. Why don't we call it the Oil for Food matter? Why not? It's the UN, right? Well, anyway, suffice it to say that we did call it the Oil for Food scandal, and then the question arose, well, what do we do about it? Now, Volcker, reflecting his background, recommended that the UN as a whole needed strong outside independent auditors. Now, there already existed some outside auditing capability, but Volcker wanted to institutionalize it and make it much more important. Independent outside auditors. How's that for a call to revolution? Well, I mean, what's going to be next? Who's to stop this sort of thing? Next, you could ask for accountability on the part of UN managers. Outside auditors. So, raising this battle flag of revolution, Secretary General Annan recommended that the UN General Assembly adopt the Volcker Commission report, and he had a range of other recommendations too. We thought the recommendations were first steps, Mostly, we agreed with most of them. We didn't think they would be adequate, but have to start somewhere. So we endorsed them, and we then entered into an extended period of negotiation in the General Assembly's Fifth Committee, the Budget and Management Oversight Committee, to endorse the Volcker Commission recommendation that Secretary General Kofi Annan himself had endorsed. The net-net was that we finally came to a vote on these recommendations, very unusual in the UN system where everything is done by consensus, or where that's at least the theory. And here was the vote. 51 or 52 countries in favor of an outside independent auditing capability, and 120 plus against. The 50 plus that voted in favor of the outside auditors contribute 90% of the assessed contributions of the UN. 90%. The 120 that voted against contribute less than 10%. That tells you everything you need to know. So what was the final outcome? An outside advisory committee. All right, by God. Doesn't that get your blood flowing? How is it possible that in the wake of the oil for food scandal, a substantial majority of the UN's members could object to outside auditing? And yet that's what happened. Let me take another example of reform. The UN Human Rights Council, the body created to replace the UN Human Rights Commission, all agreed that the Human Rights Commission was a travesty, that it was an embarrassment to people who thought seriously about human rights. Commission that spent most of its time writing resolutions either critical of Israel or the United States. What do you want to do today? Well, we did Israel yesterday. Why don't we do the United States today? Everybody agreed that the UN's credibility was damaged by this, including Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was among the most prominent calling for reform of the Human Rights Commission. So we and our European friends put together a series of procedural changes, no one of which in and of itself would fundamentally alter the Commission, but which taken together held out the promise of a decision-making body that really cared about human rights instead of being a body that defended the records of the grossest human rights abusers, reducing the size of the Commission, having a two-thirds majority requirement to get elected to the Commission, screening for applicants for membership on the Commission to look at their own human rights records, and a series of others. As I say, no one of which was dispositive, but all of which taken together could have made a difference. The non-aligned movement, supported by Russia and China, fiercely resisted these reforms. And our European friends, one by one, gave up these procedural changes, one by one by one. During which discussion, I basically said, I think you're making a mistake. I don't agree to giving this one up. I don't agree to giving that one up. I don't agree to giving that one up. And it was a very unproductive negotiation, even within the Western group. I knew that the game was over when our European friends gave up this procedural reform. We had recommended, and they had agreed, that no government should serve on the new Human Rights Council if it was the subject of Security Council sanctions for gross abuses of human rights or support for terrorism. Could not be a member of the Human Rights Council if you were subject to sanctions as a gross abuser of human rights. And the Europeans gave it up. So I said, and obviously with the approval of Secretary Rice and probably higher authority as well, that we were going to vote against the General Assembly resolution creating the new Human Rights Council, because this retreat from the reforms that we had proposed unquestionably would mean a new body that was no better than the one we already had and quite likely would be worse. And that was a mistake in my view, because having gone through this enormous effort to reform the UN's human rights decision-making mechanism, there was effectively no chance that we would revisit it within the professional career or maybe the lifetime of anybody involved in the effort. and that it was better to let the existing commission go forward for another year to demonstrate, to remind everybody one more time, if they needed reminding, just how bad it was, and try again later to get real reform. The European ambassadors uniformly said they couldn't do that, that giving up would be such a catastrophic defeat for UN reform that they couldn't imagine doing it. And what we really needed to do was have a better campaign to convince our respective capitals that we had actually achieved reform. That's their version of success at the UN. And I said I wasn't going to put, I was ahead of my time, I said I wasn't going to put lipstick on a caterpillar and call it a butterfly. So I was proud. I think it was one of my proudest moments at the UN to cast the U.S. vote against this new resolution, along with only 3 other countries, our 3 strongest allies at the UN, Israel, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. But I'll tell you something, we were absolutely right. This new body is as bad or worse than the body that succeeded, and that's just not my opinion. That's the opinion of the editorial pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. So to our European friends, you can suck that one up and get used to it. This is an example of how reform, pseudo-reform at the UN actually holds back the prospect of real reform. Now, I'll just leave the reform subject with one further thought. I have been involved in UN matters basically to a greater or lesser extent since I was at the Agency for International Development, which now, God forbid, is over 25 years. I've seen reform in all manner and shape, and I've concluded that there's only one reform at the UN that will make any fundamental difference, and that's to switch from a system of mandatory contributions, or assessed contributions as they're called, to a system of purely voluntary contributions. Each country contributes what it wants to the programs it wants and doesn't contribute to those that it thinks are ineffective or counterproductive. Now, I happen to think that there's actually sound empirical evidence for the proposition that voluntary contributions lead to more effective UN bodies. The World Food Program, UNICEF, the High Commissioner for Refugees are UN agencies that are essentially all funded by voluntary contributions. And they are generally regarded as the most productive, the most transparent, the most responsible of all of the bodies in the UN system, because they know that if people don't think that they're spending the money that they get wisely, they will go somewhere else. This is an attitude that ought to permeate the UN system. So my radical reform for the UN is we should pay for what we want and insist that we get what we pay for. How about that? Now, let's turn to what the UN's central focus was intended to be in 1945 when it was created, but what it has failed to be over the years and what it is failing to be today. And that's the maintenance of international peace and security. The UN Charter gives the UN a very broad mandate, but in the words of the preamble, it was obviously the experience of 2 catastrophic world wars within the lifetimes of the people drafting the UN Charter that was principally their focus. And it was intended to avoid the scourge of war, which twice in their lifetimes, as they put it, had devastated the planet. Now, for the first 45 years of its existence, the Security Council was largely irrelevant because of the Cold War. This was the great climatic battle of the second half of the 20th century. This was the Third World War that we fought, and we fought it with our European and other allies, and we won it. No thanks to the United Nations. Because of the prospect of vetoes in the Security Council, it was a sideline observer to that fundamental struggle for the preservation of human liberty. Now, with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, and indeed the collapse of the Soviet Union, many people thought that the Security Council could resume or could pick up the role that the framers had written in the UN Charter with these very high, noble ideals. But the fact is, if you look at the two principal threats that the United States and I think most civilized nations face in the world today, terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the UN has proved itself fundamentally unable to act. It is as essentially sidelined in these two great struggles as it was during the Cold War. Let's just take the example of terrorism first. The UN for probably 20 years or more has struggled to define terrorism and has been unable to do so because there are still many member governments that think there are some forms of terrorism that are acceptable and some forms of terrorism that are not acceptable. And trying to get agreement for the proposition that no terrorist acts are acceptable has eluded us. And I think it's fairly obvious that if you can't define what your objective is, you can't define what your adversary is, you're going to be hampered, to say the least, in trying to oppose it. And this is reflected in a range of different problems that the UN has had that encompass the threat of international terrorism but go beyond it as well. For example, in the tragic case of the three provinces of Darfur in Sudan, because people were not willing to take strong enough action in the Security Council, the government of Sudan has been able to frustrate efforts to put in an effective UN peacekeeping force to replace the African Union force that everyone agrees simply didn't have the capability to restrain all of the parties from engaging in acts of human rights abuses, and indeed is perpetrated by the government of Sudan, what to me is clearly a campaign of genocide. If the UN can't address something like Darfur, you have to ask yourself, what exactly do we really expect out of it? Now, this is an area where the United States and the European members of the Security Council have absolutely no significant national security interest, notwithstanding the fact that the government of Sudan has routinely said, we oppose having a UN peacekeeping force in Darfur because we think it's the opening door for NATO to take over the Sudan. I hate to tell this to the rulers in Khartoum. I don't know of anybody in NATO who wants to take over the Sudan. But that's the argument they use. And how are they able to protect themselves in the Security Council? Because Russia and China fly cover for them. Why do they do that? Because in the case of China, the government of Khartoum has control over substantial oil and natural gas assets which can be leased internationally. And because of China's high and rising demand for energy, the need to protect potential sources for oil and natural gas weighs heavily in their foreign policy considerations. This is an example of breakdown of the most fundamental kind. And in fact, it's reflective of the breakdown of UN peacekeeping more generally. I have a chapter in my book, Surrender is Not an Option, on Darfur and the failure of UN peacekeeping in Africa. And I tell you, it's rare in books about the UN that anybody talks about these failures in Africa. But I was moved to do it, even though I don't think it prompted a lot of readership in this country, because the African ambassadors themselves told me privately, which is the way you find out most things at the UN, they told me privately they fully understood that the UN's failure to be effective in critical peacekeeping operations harmed them more than it harmed anybody else. The tragedy is that they were not willing to say so publicly, because had they been, there might have been some possibility of actually doing anything about it. The UN's failures go beyond that as well in the area of peacekeeping. When I assumed the presidency of the Council in February of 2006, I tried to hold two open sessions on two subjects of extraordinary concern to the United States. One was the question of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers, which had been reported in many, many peacekeeping operations around the world and had been the subject of a study by Jordan's permanent representative, which revealed patterns and practices of sexual exploitation and abuse that were chilling. I mean, here are peacekeepers sent out to protect the most vulnerable populations around the world, people ravaged by war, civil war, subject to gross abuses of human rights, and it was the UN peacekeepers who were furthering these abuses of human rights by engaging in sexual exploitation and abuse. The non-aligned movement opposed the Security Council having a meeting on this subject because they said it should be the subject of meetings in the General Assembly, which until I called my meeting in the Security Council had had no meetings on the subject. The second issue I wanted to bring up was waste, fraud, and abuse in UN peacekeeping, prompted by an audit by the UN's own internal watchdog agency in examining on a random basis about $1 billion of UN peacekeeping contracts. They found some $300 million out of this random audit wasted or unaccounted for. Now, this was a stunning number because that particular year, $300 million was almost exactly the size of the U.S. contribution to peacekeeping activities, meaning Congress was appropriating money that was about in substance to be lost. And the UN Secretariat didn't want those hearings to go forward and, in fact, denied my request to have the Undersecretary General for the Office of Internal Oversight Services speak directly to the Security Council. Now, I think that's another example that speaks volumes about what goes on in the UN system and reflects failure on the part of the Security Council to be able to handle these kinds of issues. Now, let me just conclude with the failure of the Security Council on proliferation. And I bring this up because even in the past couple of years, we've seen a number of Security Council sanctions against North Korea for its launch of ballistic missiles and its testing of a nuclear weapon in October of 2006, and a series of 3 Security Council resolutions imposing economic sanctions on Iran for its nuclear weapons program. The fact is that the threat of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and in fact, the perfect storm that I fear, nuclear weapons in the hands of a terrorist group, is the most compelling, should be the most compelling issue on the Security Council's agenda. And yet, in all the resolutions that it's passed, the Security Council has in effect had no impact either on North Korea or on Iran beyond what the United States and a few member governments, other member governments were already doing. And indeed, the whole problem with the UN's ineffectiveness on proliferation can be summed up by something that didn't happen. About a week before North Korea conducted its nuclear test in late 2006, they said publicly that they were going to do it. And so I asked for a meeting of the Security Council, which happened that month to be under the presidency of Japan, probably the country in the world next to the United States that most cares about the threat that North Korea poses to the rest of us. And I asked for the meeting so that the Security Council could engage in preventative diplomacy. Now, if you have read the literature about the UN's role in the world for the past 20 years, you will read volumes on how only the UN can engage in preventative diplomacy, that this is the way ahead to avoid wars and civil wars, that if only we give the UN more responsibility, there would be more preventative diplomacy and fewer conflicts in the world. So I said, in the opening of a private meeting of the Security Council, I said that's why I had asked for the meeting, that it was I could imagine no better circumstance within which to engage in preventative diplomacy, that we had some thoughts on behalf of the United States to contribute, but that I really hope that member governments would take this opportunity, engage in preventative diplomacy, and perhaps stop North Korea from engaging in a nuclear test. I finished, and the Japanese ambassador said, "The floor is open." And that's what happened. Nobody had anything to say. Now, normally the President of the Security Council speaks last, just as a matter of protocol, but since nobody else had anything to say, the Japanese ambassador gave his government's position, which, needless to say, was the same as the U.S.'s, urgently asking the Council to take up this challenge and engage in preventative diplomacy. Then he threw the floor open again, and again there was silence. Now, finally, a few governments spoke and said, well, yes, this is very serious, no kidding. Nothing happened, and North Korea exploded its nuclear device. That, ladies and gentlemen, is your UN at work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bolton. We have the ambassador for about another half hour before he has to run off to Newark. And I'm delighted to see so many students here and such a big turnout. It's our tradition and practice in the Madison program to reserve the first part of the Q&A for student questions, so I will now open the floor for students. Yes, the one right here, and Betsy, you'll give him the microphone. Good.
Thank you for coming and speaking today. I was just wondering if you thought one possible solution to the apparently deteriorating condition at the UN is to strengthen regional organizations, or if you see the future just to be this sort of apathy and basically lack of success in the UN and really no means for international cooperation.
Yeah, the questions about regional organizations, they are contemplated in the UN Charter as having a very significant role. In effect, the idea being the UN would become involved when the regional organizations were ineffective. It's certainly a proposal that people make routinely. I favor it myself. I don't see any prospect of it happening. There's one regional organization to date that's really effective in its area, and that's the Organization of American States. The peacekeeping operation in Haiti, which I think has generally been regarded as fairly successful, as a joint UN-OAS operation. I think really the OAS deserves more of the credit. But the other regional organizations have simply not been capable of taking up the burden. I mentioned Darfur a few moments ago, and here was a case where it's now called the African Union, but the OAU, as we used to call it, tried to take up the burden of peacekeeping and by its own admission wasn't able to do it. And where efforts at peacemaking, of negotiating some kind of end of the conflict between the rebels in Darfur and the central government, tried on several occasions, ultimately all came to fail. That, I think, in part is why so much ends up on the UN plate. And I think that's unfortunate because I think there's a span of control problem in the Security Council. I think it has not done its job. Generally, there's too much of a temptation, having created a peacekeeping force, basically to say that's the Secretariat's problem. And this was a position I desperately tried to change in the Security Council, to say we were the ones responsible for solving the problem as well as creating the peacekeeping force, and that was a position that did not find support.
Can you say a word about whether the weakness of the regional organization is inherent, or is it just contingent?
Yeah, I think in many respects, I think the weakness is inherent in the regional organizations for the same reason that it finds itself in the UN. On a good day, the UN is simply the reflection of the international geostrategic reality. And therefore, sometimes it's worse than on a good day because of the nature of the UN community. But an organization, let's go back to the African Union, has the same internal difficulty where the sub-Saharan countries often find themselves pitted against the North African countries. And you'll recall earlier I said people like to make decisions by consensus. Well, if you have to make decisions by consensus, it only takes a small number to block. And I think that is, until the regional organizations are prepared to do something about that, that's not likely to change. Now, I'll just say one further thing involving NATO, which was contemplated under the Treaty of Washington to be a regional organization. It is the one that succeeded, but not for the reasons envisioned in the UN Charter. And indeed, it's been NATO that was prepared to act when the Security Council was blocked in Kosovo. People hate to be partisan here, but people who have been critical of the Bush administration for being unilateralist and not passing Senator Kerry's global test of legitimacy in Iraq tend to forget that it was the Clinton administration faced with a certain Russian veto against a resolution authorizing force against Serbia, which had NATO take care of the Kosovo conflict in the late 1990s. So this was a case where not only where the regional organization actually found itself effectively in conflict with the lack of decision-making in the Security Council.
More student questions. Now, I know we have a lot of students who are here from Professor Schultz's class who are studying international organizations. So, yes, are you one? Please.
So my question is specifically about the Security Council. You mentioned several times that the Security Council is made up of countries, and especially countries like Russia and China often block Security Council effectiveness due to their veto power. Is there any reform of the Security Council, especially in its makeup or voting procedures, that you think would lead to greater effectiveness?
Yeah. Well, this has been the subject of debate in the UN for close to 20 years now. And it turns principally on the argument that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council reflect the world as it was in 1945 and don't reflect the world as it is today. And therefore, to make the Security Council effective, the permanent members in particular should be changed to update the Council and give it more legitimacy. Now, this obviously leads you to the question of who qualifies to be a permanent member. And I got into some difficulty, not bad, but some difficulty during my confirmation battle because of something I had said some years ago, namely that there was really only one country qualified to be a permanent member. Once you start down from there, it gets a little dicey. And the hang-up is that while I think there's agreement that at least in some cases you could find broad agreement as to countries that could be added, there's no agreement that you should stop with those countries. For example, I think, and it's been the position of the United States since the Nixon administration, that Japan should be a permanent member of the Security Council, given the size of its economy, given the fact that it's the second largest contributor under the most recent assessment formula, a little bit over 17%, I think, just under the U.S. 22% share. I think this is an easy case. But I'm not sure Japan will ever be a member of the Security Council as long as China has a veto. Japan first came to make a serious effort to get on the Security Council during the Bush 41 administration. And I remember, because I was the International Organization Assistant Secretary at the time, they came to Washington, they laid out the case. I said, that's great, we'll support you. How are you going to do it? And that was sort of the end of that round of the consultation because they couldn't figure out how to get themselves on without getting everybody else on, because faced with the prospect of Japan becoming a permanent member, Germany said, well, we deserve to be a permanent member. We're the largest economy in Europe, and we deserve to be a permanent member. They're the third largest contributor to the UN system. That, of course, prompted Italy to say, over our dead body, we should be a permanent member. I mean, let's get all the defeated powers from World War II on the Security Council. Have the winners, the losers, whatever. Now, the prospect of Europe, which actually already has 2 permanent members in the form of Britain and France, getting 2 more permanent members drives the other countries crazy. Among other reasons, because the Europeans never tire of telling us how the European Union is the new model of interstate cooperation. Some say it's a state under construction. I don't know if the Europeans really know what they want to be when they grow up, but somehow or another, the European Union has taken on many of the functions of the traditional nation state. So why is it that Europe, therefore, would get, under these theories, 3 or 4 permanent members? I said once that I could accept 3 or 4 European permanent members if the U.S. got 3 or 4 vetoes, just so we would be at some kind of rough parity. Well, the odds of Germany and Italy getting on the Security Council are probably lower than Japan's, but that doesn't stop others. Brazil says, well, look, we're a big economy. We're the second biggest country in the Western Hemisphere. There's no Latin American permanent member of the Security Council, we should be a permanent member. They've got a reasonable argument, except if you happen to be Argentinian or Venezuelan or Colombian or Mexican and say, you know, those guys speak Portuguese. And if we're going to have a Latin American permanent member, it's going to be somebody who speaks Espanol, thank you very much. Then there's India, which says, look, we are the second most populous country in the world. We've got a rising economy. We're a powerful country. We deserve to be a permanent member, which immediately prompts Pakistan to say, at the same time, we become a permanent member. And that leads them into not reaching the question what China would do if an Indian membership, permanent membership on the Security Council really became a possibility. So in typical UN fashion, when you've got this web of arguments of countries with reasonable claims, I don't mean to dismiss them as frivolous by any stretch of the imagination, they have reasonable claims. So the UN answer is to say, well, let's make them all permanent members. Now, let's bear in mind that the UN Charter started out with a Security Council of 11 members, increased in the 1960s to 15 because of the wave of colonial independence. Most of these proposals for new permanent members leave you with a council of 23, 24 members or more. I can tell you, and I wish if you could sit in the council room with all 15 countries there hour after hour, with everybody thinking they've got to say something, you know, listening to the representative of Belgium talking about peacekeeping in Haiti and the ambassador of Peru talking about the Central African Republic. It's just really enlightening. When you've got 15 people talking about it, imagine what it would be with 23 or 24 or more when you actually have something serious to do. I mean, there were moments when I was feeling irresponsible. I used to think, why am I opposed to this? Why not just let it happen? And then you wouldn't have to worry about the Security Council anymore because it wouldn't be able to do anything. But then responsibility would overtake me again, and I'd say this is a prescription for gridlock on the Security Council. So my conclusion is, having watched Japan for nearly 20 years now, unable to get itself across the threshold, my guess is that there will not be reform in the Security Council. And I don't see anything, having watched years of debate on it, that produces the magic bullet that solves the problem.
All right, more students. Yes.
Given the recent revelations of the mismanagement of U.S. or UN peacekeeping funds and the failures in Darfur and other situations, do you think that the U.S. should continue to support peacekeeping missions around the world, or is there a better way to pursue humanitarian interventions or interventions to stop conflicts in situations that affect U.S. interests?
Well, I think in situations that truly affect U.S. interest, we're not going to see UN peacekeeping forces. And in fact, I don't think we'll see UN peacekeeping forces any place where any of the permanent members have interest or where any significant UN member has an interest. Which is not to say there won't be interventions. You know, the Russian invasion of Georgia was characterized as a peacekeeping operation. And I think it's a convenient rhetorical hook. I think the real issue for UN operations is that the Security Council has to take responsibility for solving the problem and not just creating a peacekeeping force. And if the UN peacekeeping force has in effect over time become part of the problem, then the UN has to bite the bullet and eliminate the force. I'll give you a few examples. In the Western Sahara, we created MINURSO, a peacekeeping force in 1991, 1992, to conduct a referendum among the citizens of the Western Sahara as to the future status of that territory. Would it be independent or would it join with Morocco? Because of reasons that are that go back to pre-colonial days, we've never been able to agree on the right census, and we've never, therefore, held the referendum. There's now 16 years of a peacekeeping force in the Western Sahara, which is solidifying the status quo, which basically means Moroccan control. Now, the Algerians don't like that. The Polisario Front, the representative of the Sahrawi people, at least that's their contention, wouldn't like abolishing the peacekeeping force. But frankly, if they're not prepared to find a way to agree with the Moroccans, that force just legitimizes Moroccan control over the territory. Let me give you another example, the peacekeeping force between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ethiopia and Eritrea had a disputed boundary. They agreed toward the end of the Clinton administration to create a mediation, an arbitration boundary commission, and they committed that they would accept the results of the commission's deliberation on the border. And a peacekeeping force was put in to separate the sides while this was going on. The Eritrean Ethiopian Border Commission deliberated. It came back with a border. It said both parties agreed to it. Now we're going to demarcate the border. And the Ethiopians said, we don't like the outcome. And so the Eritreans, I don't have a brief on either side of this controversy, by the way. The Eritreans said, hey, wait a minute. The agreement is we have this arbitration and you're supposed to accept it. And if you're not going to accept it, we want the peacekeeping force withdrawn. And that's what we should have done, but we didn't do it. So what happens is, because the Security Council finds it easy to create peacekeeping forces to kind of get the problem off the front page, but finds it difficult, A, to solve the underlying problem, or B, face up to its responsibility to say, this has failed, we have peacekeeping operations that go on indefinitely. And there are many other examples like this. This is the kind of failure of decision-making capability that leads to management overload and loss of span of control. You can barely keep up with the reports and meetings the Council has, even on the most mundane peacekeeping forces. So it's no wonder you can't get on to larger tasks. This is not a failure of the UN Secretariat. This is a failure of the member governments of the Security Council.
Good. These are deeply well-informed and illuminating questions. Reminds me why it's such a pleasure to teach at this place. Yes, you. Yes, please. Yeah, she'll bring you the microphone.
You briefly touched on the failure of the Security Council in terms of nuclear proliferation, and I was wondering if you think the UN serves any value at all in terms of U.S. strategic interests in counterterrorism.
I don't think it does serve any interest at all in terms of U.S. interests in counterterrorism. In the first place, as I said, they can't agree on what terrorism is. Second, the heart of the struggle against terrorism requires intelligence sharing. And it's just inconceivable to me we would share much intelligence on counterterrorism efforts in the context of the United Nations. So as long as this divide exists between those who think there's a good kind of terrorism and a bad kind of terrorism on the one hand, and those who think all terrorism is unacceptable, I don't see that the UN can play much of a role. And I think that's extraordinarily unfortunate, but reflective of the fact that when people go to the Security Council, they don't suddenly become platonic guardians. All 192 countries, members of the UN, advance their own national interest. And when there's gridlock, that's in part because that's what they're doing. Actually, there's only one country that ever gets criticized for advancing its national interest at the UN, and that's the United States.
Yes, Ms. Schiff.
You touched on problems of the Human Rights Council and other human rights institutions at the UN, but I was wondering if you think there might be just as much of a problem with disengagement as there is with engagement.
Well, I don't think you can answer that question in the abstract. I think the right answer on the replacement of the Human Rights Commission was not to put in false reform. And I think what happened over the course of the negotiations is that the new body, in effect, will be, as I said, just as bad as the body it replaced. So the question then is, what do you do about it? And my answer is, until you get at least some of the reforms we wanted, you're really, it was an episode of The Twilight Zone where it's a better example is the movie Groundhog Day. It's just the same thing over and over again. So my view is not only should the United States not seek election to this new commission, this would be one of my first targets for defunding. And if the other member governments want to continue with this charade, that's fine. Let them pay for it.
I don't want to neglect students on this side. You asked one already, didn't you? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, then go ahead. That was the person in front of you. I'm sorry to mix you up.
Hi. Thank you very much for your comments today. You mentioned the idea of voluntary contributions, and I'm wondering whether having voluntary contributions ends up delegitimizing the whole system, in that if what happens is the U.S., let's say, as the primary contributor, ends up only contributing to the issues that it wants to, so essentially the other countries, it seems like, will just say that this is really a Western bias system and we have no part in this anyway, and you sort of lose any sort of semblance of unity, and in terms of the idea of the UN being a forum for all countries to get together and work on issues together.
Well, and what would they have to gain by that? What would their gain be if they walked away from the UN?
Well, I'm wondering whether it makes the UN even less effectual in the sense that...
How can it be less effectual?
Well, no, it's a great point, because I'm wondering whether long term it actually is the nail in the coffin that you end up having a system that you just end up trashing altogether.
Let me give you another example that I followed more during the Bush 41 administration than I actually was able to do when I was in New York. The World Health Organization, which has had some significant successes in combating a variety of diseases around the world, was gripped in the late 1980s and 1990s by management problems over what was then a relatively small program to combat HIV/AIDS that had been set up, funded by voluntary contributions by governments that were concerned, particularly the United States. This was during the Clinton administration, during the late Reagan administration, and by Western European governments. But WHO's bureaucracy kept trying to take control of it, and it was making the program less effective. And ultimately what happened was that, which I think was an unfortunate decision, the HIV/AIDS program was spun off from the World Health Organization. Even though the problems caused by AIDS are associated with other kinds of diseases, and which in fact magnify the problem, and where if you were thinking about it strategically, you'd want all of this considered together. But because HIV/AIDS was considered so important and such a priority, to save it from the WHO bureaucracy, it was spun off, where it has performed, I think by most accounts, highly successfully, and where it's funded by voluntary contributions. This is obviously an issue important to the developed countries and to the developing world in particular. And it's something that I think nobody would now advocate, shoving this program back into WHO. I mentioned the World Food Program, UNICEF, the High Commissioner for Refugees, all of which deliver services principally of interest to the third world countries, but which are funded voluntarily by the developed countries. I don't know anybody who has argued that those should be moved from voluntary to mandatory contribution. So I think the empirical evidence is limited, to be sure, but what it is supports the argument that voluntary contributions give you more responsive, more effective programs.
On this side? Yes, up there.
Again, thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for coming. You wrote an article on October 2nd that was published on the American Enterprise Institute website, arguing that in light of the recent demise of Kim Jong-il's health...
Actually, it was published by the Wall Street Journal, so just to give
credit, right,
yeah.
Both as part of the American Enterprise Institute and in the WSJ, arguing that in light of Kim Jong-il's recent declining health, it wouldn't be entirely a bad thing if North Korea... Sure, sorry. If North Korea, as a country, were to effectively fall apart. And you conclude the article by saying that in the long run, North Korea might turn out to be a valuable U.S. ally in Southeast Asia. I was wondering if you could comment, especially since we're at an institution of education, on how that's necessarily so given recent allegations that the Korean system of education is designed to teach North Korean students that the U.S. is fascist and not to be trusted.
Well, the argument in the op-ed was that the health crisis of Kim Jong-il, of which we are still largely ignorant, these recent pictures notwithstanding, it appears they may have been taken before the August health incident. But the fact is, we don't know what Kim Jong-il's health really is at the moment. And that, by definition, in a closed society like North Korea, creates a situation of regime crisis. Nick Eberstadt, who is one of my colleagues at AEI and a true expert on internal North Korean affairs, and I said that the point is, if not that we wanted to provoke a regime crisis, but that Kim Jong-il's health situation was in and of itself the seed for a potential crisis, that we should look for ways not to stabilize the regime in North Korea, but if there was a crisis, to see if this might not be an opportunity to bring about the collapse of the regime and the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And Eberstadt's work over the years has shown that the cost of reunification to South Korea is only going to get larger. The differences between the North and the South are growing, and the fear that reunification would be a huge burden for the South Koreans only gets worse over time. And it will be an enormous burden. The statistics show that from a common base right after World War II, the average height and weight of the North Korean population has been falling over time. And that today, depending on what statistics you use, the average North Korean male is between 3 and 6 inches shorter than his South Korean counterpart. Just think about that. Just think about the kind of a regime that does that to its own people. If you don't care about nuclear weapons, which God knows I spend a lot of time worrying about, think about that kind of regime. And tell me you want to stabilize things on the Korean Peninsula, stabilizing 23 million North Koreans into a prison camp. It is an incredibly risky situation at this moment of regime crisis, if that's what we're going through. And nobody underestimates how dangerous the situation is with a country that has nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. But the argument that our highest objective is to have a smooth transition of power in North Korea from one brutal dictator to another, I don't buy.
Okay, students can continue to have hands in the air, but I'll also recognize professors and guests and others. Yeah, Professor Sigmund.
Just one factual point, the Haitian operation is a UN operation. One factual point, the Haitian operation is a UN operation. I've been down there 3 times.
It's joint. No, it's joint.
The UN signs and...
Tell the OAS it's a UN operation.
Yeah, all the labels are UN. It's true that the troops are, the majority of the troops are Latin American.
Troop commander's always been a Latin American. This is how it's worked out.
All right, that's a minor point.
It wasn't a minor point when you started out.
Well, I didn't mean it to... I'm sorry. A short point and a long point. The short point would be to ask you what you think about the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights as an example of norming. Are you against all norming, or are you only against norming that you agree with? And the second point would be, generally, a lot of the writing about the two terms of the Bush administration have contrasted the first administration and the second, describing the first as, well, somebody in the New York Times, predictably, said yesterday, bellicose unilateralism, but then said the second administration was much more internationalist, working with allies and recognizing the reality of soft power. I wonder if you'd agree with that analysis and what you think of it.
Well, with respect to the first question, I think that what has happened with norming and what the prospects are going forward is that it has become an instrument of those that are trying to constrain the United States. And I do object to that on the basis that that's not in our interest. I don't think the Human Rights Declaration is as wonderful a document as many people think. I don't think there's a right to leisure. I don't find that in our Constitution, and I don't think putting it in the Human Rights Declaration really advanced the ball on that subject. I'm all in favor of leisure. Just want to know whose right it is to assert. Now, with respect to the Bush administrations, are you talking about Bush 41 versus Bush 43, or first term versus second term? Yeah. Yeah, well, you know, I think the administrations are fundamentally different, but I think the irony is that the criticism of the Bush administration that you mentioned of bellicose unilateralism just is wide of the mark. Let me give you a few examples. In the question of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, there were 26 coalition members in that operation. That was not unilateral. And people say, well, go ahead and list the coalition members. And so you start off with the next biggest coalition member, which is the United Kingdom. And people say, oh, well, they don't count. Well, I don't know. They speak English, I suppose. I don't know what their problem is, but tell the Brits they don't count. And you can go through other members as well. Ask yourself what the coalition was in the Balkans War of the late 1990s in terms of the air attacks against Serbia. The overwhelming predominance of combat and combat support missions were American and British and French, to the point where American pilots, because the other NATO countries didn't have compatibility in equipment or interoperability in communications, the American pilots took to wearing T-shirts that said, if you're not big enough to hunt with the big dogs, stay on the porch. And that was touted as, muscular in the Clinton administration. If the Bush administration had done that, I suppose somebody would have said that was an example of bellicose unilateralism. Let me give you another example. Faced with the threat of WMD proliferation through trafficking, international trafficking in weapons and materials of mass destruction, we undertook two major efforts during the first term of the Bush administration. The first was to create the G8 program against the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, basically taking the Nunn-Lugar program for financing the destruction of Soviet-era missiles, nuclear weapons, and chemical and biological weapons, and multilateralizing it to get all of the G8 members to contribute, to help add to the amount of money that was available for weapons destruction. We originally called it the 10 plus 10 over 10 program. The U.S. spends about $1 billion a year on this. We suggested the other G8 members, not including Russia, which was going to be a beneficiary, so basically the other 6 members, together come up with another $1 billion. We would spend that out over a 10-year period. And we subsequently expanded that to include a number of other non-G8 members and to enhance cooperation for the ongoing destruction of Russian Soviet-era weapons, and now also to be available in territories other than that of the former Soviet Union. I happen to think that's a very good program. I was happy to be part of the negotiations that set it up, and it was entirely a multilateral effort. Indeed, the express purpose of it was to spread the burden a little bit to some of our European and Japanese friends. The second example is the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was a multilateral effort to coordinate intelligence, military, and law enforcement activities to stop trafficking in nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and their components. And it's had a number of significant successes, not the least of which was being part of the destruction of the AQ-CON proliferation network and exposing the Libyan nuclear weapons program, and many others that remain classified that I can't talk about. But that was another one that I was more than happy to participate in. So I think if you look at the facts, I know what the reputation is. I hear it all the time. It's just flatly wrong.
This side? Yeah, up there. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Yeah, you.
Hi, so I'm here on behalf of the country that doesn't count. Or your juvenile European allies. I don't know how you'd want to style us. But
Which country doesn't count?
Sorry?
Which country doesn't count?
Britain, the one you just spoke about.
I didn't say I thought it didn't count. It was everybody else that said, well, so what if you've got Britain next to you? That doesn't prove it's multinational.
But I first of all wanted to make the point. I actually find it staggering that you think the U.S. shouldn't be constrained in any way in its foreign policy.
I didn't say that.
You did when we were talking about the UN Human Rights Declaration. You said that it shouldn't be constrained in any way. It's part of your general argument against norming, I believe. I mean, isn't the idea that certain truth is self-evident the foundation of the Constitution, and therefore that there can be some documents or principles which can be applied universally, a fundamentally American value? And building on this concept of legitimacy, to make a case for the beleaguered United Nations, don't you think that's where its strength really lies? Given that Britain and America have recently invaded Iraq and now find themselves embroiled in conflict there, and have laid themselves open to diplomatic criticism from many sides because of what can be styled as partisanship in the highest degree, owing to the fact that they don't have multilateral support through these organizations. Don't you think that's going to be a fundamental weakness which you will open up any administration to if they refuse to work through organizations like the UN?
Well, let's try and take this in a reality check. What is the difference between the NATO attack on Serbia, not authorized by a Security Council resolution, and undertaken in the face of a clear threat of a Russian veto? Why is that any more or less legitimate than what the coalition did against Iraq?
You have regional powers closely involved with geopolitical links to the Balkan area in the first instance.
Well, wait a minute.
Well, what would be the regional organization that you'd use to invade Iraq?
What regional organization opposed us in Serbia?
Well, none. But the fact is you used one to get there.
Well,
NATO.
Other countries in the region had important concerns about Iraq, too. Turkey did, Kuwait did, Saudi Arabia did.
But you didn't use a multilateral organization.
No, I'll tell you something. The United States had more UN legitimacy for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein than NATO did for the bombing of Serbia. Why is that? Because the original Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force, Resolution 678, authorized the use of force until the Security Council stopped it, which it did in the ceasefire resolution 687. And the ceasefire resolution rested on the obligations imposed as a matter of Chapter 7, binding international law for those who believe in it, binding on Iraq to comply with the many, many provisions of that resolution, which Iraq serially violated. Now, when you have that kind of obligation and one party doesn't live up to it, it follows inexorably that the other parties are relieved of their obligations and the original authorization to use force in 678 comes back into play. We did have international legitimacy provided by the Security Council resolution, which distinguishes that from what NATO did with Serbia. So we had actually, under your terms, more legitimacy.
We've held the ambassador a little longer than we had intended to, but let's hold him just another minute, John, if you don't mind. There's a question over here. We'll do one more question. Yeah. Microphone.
This sort of draws on the last comment, particularly the European relationship to the Balkans being the fact that's where the First World War began. It's also a case where Britain won ultimately in that conflict. Their stability in Iraq was less so in the beginning of the 20th century. Regards that, a lot of the
Well, let me just stop you there, because the argument here isn't the particular geopolitical context of the Balkans versus Iraq. The argument is if you're only permitted to use force because of a Security Council resolution, we had more Security Council legitimacy to overthrow Saddam than NATO did to attack Serbia. Do you disagree with that? And if you do, where was the Security Council legitimacy for the NATO attack on Serbia?
I'm just a historian. I was only interjecting some historical observations. I don't deign to foreign policy. The larger question, though, is that in many of your comments, basically what you're saying is the UN is a crisis of decolonization, that there were lots of other structures in place beforehand, more unilateral and multilateral relationships which governed the world through European imperialism. Not to say that that's an inherently bad thing. I mean, for instance, Niall Ferguson up at Harvard thinks that there's a lot of virtue in the former British Empire. Would you suggest or potentially imagine, whether it be through regional alliances or through these sort of voluntary contributions where economic hegemony plays a larger role, that a quasi-soft colonial system would actually be a better way for stabilizing the world than thinking that there truly is a situation where one vote is one vote?
No, I don't favor quasi-colonialism. I'm an anti-imperialist. I don't believe in any supervening imperial structure. I'm just saying this organization is severely troubled, and by examining its history, you don't see a lot that gives you confidence. But I want to come back to the legitimacy point because, and I'll just finish with this story, which involves the man who may be the next Vice President of the United States. At one point during the Balkans crisis, Secretary General Kofi Annan said, we have to return to the point where we're agreed that the Security Council, these are his words, the Security Council is the sole source of legitimacy for the use of force in the world. Sole source of legitimacy for the use of force in the world. Now, during a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in New York in 2000, I testified. Senator Helms was the chair. Senator Biden was the ranking Democratic member. And this quote from Kofi Annan had just happened a relatively short time ago. And I thought this was just as emblematic of the feeling of what the Security Council's role should be for those who love it as any I could think of. The Security Council is the sole source of legitimacy for the use of force in the world. Okay, how many in this room agree with that? Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? So anyway, I thought, there I was testifying before the Foreign Relations Committee, and I thought, what better place than to have a little fun? And I said, you know, Kofi Annan has said this, sole source of legitimacy. I said, I really think the Senate of the United States should have a debate on that. I think we ought to have every senator get up and say whether they agree with that or disagree with it. And I hadn't even gotten rolling when Senator Biden interrupted me and said, no, we're not going to have any debate on that. No debate on that. He said, I love Kofi Annan. He said, but nobody in the Senate agrees with that. End of story. And I want to say, and I'll conclude, I agree with Joe Biden on that too. Thank you very much.